My name is Ray Ryan. In the mid-'80s, I was an elephant keeper, former elephant keeper now. How I wound up working with the Ellies was basically by default. I was taking care of 2 Barbary apes at San Diego State for one of the psychologists there for a very non-invasive study she was doing about matching shapes and sizes to pegboard. And when I got my degree, I basically needed a job. So I went to one of the primatologists on campus who was one of my professors, and through her connection at the San Diego Zoo, there was an opening at that time for someone to work with the great apes, which would have been great. It was about 10 minutes from my house. And she was basically on call for expertise if they had any problems, so she had a really good in. So it was pretty much a lock at the time for the job until roughly a couple days before things were supposed to work out. Got a call that the position had been taken by someone inside who had done research on baboons in Africa. So it was a logical choice. But he had been working with the African elephants at the Wild Animal Park in San Diego. Well, basically in Ramona, it's about an hour and a half away, through the Zoological Society. So she said, "Want to try your hand at working with elephants?" And my only experience of having contact with any Ellies in the past was in the late 70s. I worked briefly for Pat Derby, and she had an Asian elephant that she was taking care of. And that was my experience. So I went for the interview and got the job. One day, walked into a barn that was holding approximately 10 or 11 elephants. At the time, there was no Asian barn for the Asian elephants. So at night, the majority of them would be housed in the barn with the African elephants. Asians were pretty much in the stalls, and the Africans were lined up on the main floor. So it was a pretty intense situation to go into. And I'll be honest, I was scared to death. I had never been around that many large animals at one time, and all I kept hearing from everybody was how dangerous they were. And that didn't help when you go into your job thinking how dangerous they were. And we had to walk through the Asians to get to the Africans. That was the only way to get in. And one of the Asians was basically hated humans, big men specifically, and tried to grab me one day and take me out. And it was just really tense. It was a very volatile situation, and at that time, I learned how you took care of elephants is the majority of the time you beat them. And that was how you kept them basically submissive. The only benefit when I first started working was that the Africans had not been handled very much at all. Initially, when they were brought in to the park, everybody was so afraid of them because they were, at the time, a small wild herd that all the keepers were scared to death. They'd go anywhere near them, so nobody took care of them or handled them much. They let them out in the morning quickly and brought them in quickly and put them on chains, and that was the extent of it. So that was nice, but still scary. It was still scary at the time, so that was my introduction, and almost lost position because Peaches, one of the Africans who had been brought up from the San Diego Zoo to the park to be with the African group, because she was one of the Africans mixed in with Asians down at the San Diego Zoo, had a bad reputation of not severely hurting keepers, but taking them out, either throwing them or banging them or grabbing them with her trunk and throwing them around. And she kicked me one time, going behind her after being warned repeatedly that she was going to do it. I just didn't believe it. And she kicked me pretty good, and was told that if I didn't chain her up, and basically hit her several times all around her body and her head and legs, and that I would, if fired. So that happened. And that was an interesting experience to chain an animal up and purposely hurt it. Maybe hurt, I don't know how much it hurt her. It was more, I think, degrading to her than it was physically hurting her. But pretty much after that, and a couple more sessions, she left me alone. And I was able to work around her. But there was still, my head guy that I worked with, the lead keeper that I was working with, was pretty heavy-handed. And most of it came from the experience of working with the Asians. And he took over working with the Africans roughly, not sure exactly, roughly 2 years before I got there. And he was really heavy-handed. They respected him, but I think they were afraid of him. And that was pretty much how I learned. And that went on, including me hitting him. Not always, but to get him to do what he wanted him to do. Sometimes what they didn't want to do, you hit him. Everybody had different size elephant hooks. Mine was a pretty big, heavy one made out of very heavy resin, and it had to have hurt me sometimes. But as a result of that, I started reading a lot from Cynthia Moss and Ian Douglas Hamilton about elephant behavior and how they really work. And because this group was very, very tight, it was easy to see how easy it would be to get along with them without hitting them. And that didn't happen overnight. I don't think they believed it. And we were still trying to do certain things for them. And, really all we really had to do was do foot trims on them and, trim their nails. And that's really all we really had to do. But my boss's experience with the Asians was trying to get them to grab their tails and act like Asian elephants, and they wanted nothing of it. And that's when things were tense. I guarantee you that I didn't have a good night's sleep for at least the first year, at least the first year. I didn't sleep through the night because I was so afraid. And through a lot of us talking together and working together, as we became a pretty good working team. It took a while, but we figured, let's see what it's like if we don't do anything to them except coexist with them. And after time, this wasn't overnight stuff. The tension level just relaxed so much. And it got to a point where I was able to start making some connections on my own, not just following my boss's lead at the time. And he had his favorite, who was Peaches. And she loved him more than anything. She liked me and put up with me, but she just loved him and he loved her. The one that I got semi-close to initially was Cebu, who was, in essence, the matriarch of the original group that came in. I think altogether that was Cebu and I think four other ones. One of them died of salmonella before I got there, before I got there, from drinking bad water in the area. And the rest were pretty much followed her lead. And we just somehow started to get along. So Lou, my boss, basically said, why don't you start working with her as far as doing all of her foot trims and any other things that came out, like medically. I would be the one that would get closest to her. And it was an elephant named Hatari who was there. Looked older, but she really wasn't. She was initially in the movie Hatari with John Wayne. And she was a sweetheart, so he gave me them to basically bond with. And we did. And we did. It was a really interesting. She was still afraid at times because there was such a tight bonded group that when we would watch, when they finally built the Asian barn, eventually that came. I don't want to backtrack too much, but they eventually built the Asian barn, so the Asians were no longer in our barn. And we would watch them get released in the morning, and they would individually go out in their yard. And when we would release the Africans, they would all wait for the other ones to be released so they could basically greet each other. And it was just a unified group. It was really fun to see. They were really, except for the few, 2 years, 3 years by the time this guy came home, and the people working with them, they were pretty wild. They acted wild. And that was a blessing because they didn't have to do rides and shows like the Asians did. They didn't have to be separated. They could stay as a unit. So it was kind of nice to get to be friends with the matriarch, which Cebu was. I mean, she watched everything. She always kept an eye. Peaches was the dominant one in the yard and kind of a little bit more distant than the other ones, but she was the biggest and the toughest, and everybody knew it. We knew it, and all the others knew it. But Cebu was emotionally and mentally and at times physically the matriarch. So that's how I started getting connected to her and getting close to her. In the meantime, Lou and I were getting very, very, I guess maybe too overconfident because everybody else was afraid to go near the Africans, so that was kind of our little, I guess, niche in Alabama Park, is that we had a lot of respect, but we also started getting big heads. And unfortunately, we started looking into certain people that worked at the park and their backgrounds and just started asking too many questions that we should not have asked. So we got to the point with the Africans where we could bring people in the yard with them. We would have school groups come with kids, and we'd bring them in, and kids would, each have an apple and give it to them. It became a very, very relaxed atmosphere. And the turning point with me, with getting really close to Cebu, was a couple things happened. One was I was in the yard one day, and just sitting in the yard, and Cebu came up, and right in front of me, just laid down right in front of me. And for anybody that knows anything about elephants, how vulnerable that is to do that, and how, especially as a matriarch, to go over and lay down. And she allowed me to go up to her and, rub her head and rub her body and talk to her nicely, and went on for maybe a half hour. It was a pretty stunning experience. And from that day forward, I wish that I'd written down the date, we became extremely close, where when I would come in the yard to do anything, just even to hang out, to pick up the manure, she would greet me and pull me in her front legs. So I was literally underneath her head, tucked in, and her arms are wrapped around me, just basically the way they do for babies, I found out later. So that was my connection with her. I still got along with the rest of them, and Peaches did eventually get to know me. But Cebu got huge ovarian cysts one day. It started dropping out of her vulva, and I was close enough to her that when she eventually had surgery to remove them, she allowed me to clean the area and to make sure that everything was, I guess, not infectious, nothing would happen to her. So it became, over time, an extremely easy, loving relationship and easy to go to work. Now, it took about 2 years of time over just bringing down the energy level. So basically just hung out with them and took care of them. And we were lucky. We became part of that's what it put. We became part of the herd. To a point one time where Luke, I don't remember the exact reason, he took quite a bit of time off. It was injury or something, I really don't remember, but I was able to work by myself, the herd, which is you shouldn't do. But I was able to work the herd, and there was a point where my ex-wife, who was very small, was able to come with me and release them in the morning. Nobody knew that. They would have gotten in trouble. But they were that easygoing. They knew we weren't going to ask them to do anything except the elephants. Unfortunately, because of Lou and I getting big heads, we started looking into the background of our supervisor, Alan Rucroft, and he was the boss, who was so afraid of the Africans, he never came in the yard except with one of us because that's how scared he was. And we started finding out through background checks that he had very, very little experience with elephants, even though he was the boss. So we started mouthing off too much, and one day they set us up. And had a couple of people that were in operations come up and just acting kind of like they were out for a walk. Started talking to us and asking questions, and unfortunately we started answering them correctly. We didn't make anything up. We were correct in what we said, but they didn't like that. And so one day I came to work and was told I was no longer working with the African Americans. I would be working with the Asian Americans. Basically, to see how long I would put up with it, because they knew that I didn't believe in beating elephants or treating them the way the show people treated them and the ride people treated them. And that was an interesting experience, to go into a barn where the head keeper down there, all he had to do was raise his arm and all of them moved to the side and ducked. And that was pretty scary to see. I went from working with a pretty intact, mentally, group of elephants that, except for a couple of years of working around humans or putting up with us, I went into a barn where the elephants, the ride elephants and the show elephants, they had no affect. They were elephants, but they didn't act that much like elephants. They weren't connected to each other the way the Africans were. They were yanked here and there during the day for one to go do a ride, another to do a ride, regardless of how they were feeling or how hot it was or anything. And I was put in charge of, they had Ankoli cattle that were there at the time, which were nice, so it got me out. Because Rucroft didn't want me anywhere near that barn as much as I didn't want to be in that barn. But it was to see how long I would put up with running out in front of the show people and picking up bowling pins that were part of the show. Basically, it was just cleaning the barn. Then I started asking more questions about the background of the curator and the general manager of the park, and found out that the curator at the time, Larry Kilmar, only had a high school degree and no schooling at all in zoology, biology, anything, psychology, anything. And there were a couple times where we butted heads a couple times, and I got to say things to him, and he just basically said to me, if you don't like working here, leave. And because his job was secure. And then I started realizing what the zoo business was really about. And there was an instance, I hope some of this doesn't jumble all over the place, but there was an instance when I was there where some lions that were there were shipped off to a game ranch in Texas. And noticing that a lot of the animals that were born there stayed there for a little while and then would be gone. And, it's just something you don't want to think about. I have a picture of myself in 1973, I think it is, standing in front of the park, and it had only been open for a year, telling everybody one day I was going to work there. And Dr. Patty Scully, who was the one that had tried to get me in with great apes at the zoo, warned me about going in to the business. And she said, it's not what you think. But I said, I'll prove you wrong. And it was just a shock to see that that was the business. So, to not drag all this on, I lasted about a year down with the Asians, and was told repeatedly, if you keep your mouth shut, if you quit saying things and telling people certain things, and then we'll put you back with the Africans. I had been injured while I was with the Africans. I had my elephant hook go through my wrist at a sharp end, and was losing the feeling in my left hand. You know, it was very hard. It was very hard to have been moved away from the Africans. And then, basically, leave a job that I thought I would have stayed at for a long time. But in retrospect, I don't think I would have stayed there a lot longer. It just wasn't what it's made out to be. So that was kind of the full circle of it. So I had to leave Cebu and my relationship with them, got to go say goodbye. And took a job, basically in personnel at a residential facility for abused kids. And eventually, after having our first daughter move back to Chicago, and it was, I don't know how many years it went by, but I got to go back to a wedding in San Diego and got to go back and see the Africans. And that was pretty cool. And I got to videotape it. And got to have that memory that they still remembered me, which was interesting. You know, you think that isn't true when you hear it, but you know, once they hear your voice, they all come running up. It was a great experience. But over time, I would hear periodically that one had died, or one had gotten sick, or this one died. And eventually, where everything went full circle for me was the word was out that they had hired a guy named Jeff Andrews to run the elephant department. And he was a former trainer at SeaWorld. Pretty well-known guy. So he came in with the idea that they were going to capture, under the auspices that they were saving a small herd of elephants in Africa from being culled, which they really weren't, but it's another hour story which we don't have time to get into. But what happened was, to bring them in, they had to get rid of the last three Africans, which were Peaches and Wanky and Tatima. And where were they going? The Lincoln Park Zoo in Chicago. So that was another very interesting experience. So, to fast forward, when they came here, they were still in quarantine, you know, for I think it was 3 months. I'm not sure exactly the numbers, but 3 months. And I got to go see them again and call them, and I have that on videotape, which was great. And my daughter got to see them, which was great, because she was approximately 12 years old at the time, 13 maybe. So it was great. It was a great experience, and they didn't have a clue what they were doing with her, but you could see that it was the beginning of the end for them, because they went from 2.5 acres in Southern California pretty much their whole lives, and wound up being on a 1/4 of an acre in downtown Chicago, through the wintertime, through the smog, through the noises, through everything. So the guy that was put in charge of them had never even worked with elephants either, and he was a giraffe keeper, I'm pretty sure. And I offered to help. And then when word got out, I was constantly constantly coming there. That obviously I knew they weren't going to hire me because all they had to do was go to the rental apartment and say, you know, unfortunately, don't hire this guy. And before that happened, to backtrack, why wouldn't this? I had written a book called Keepers of the Ark about elephants in captivity, and that was out in 2000, and the Ellies arrived in 2003. So they weren't afraid. I knew. And I got to the point where every time I went in the place, somebody would shadow me and walk with me because I was able to talk to the Elephants. But over time, you could see that they were dying. You could just see. Each would never move. She would just lay against the outside wall. And the team would always lay down, wouldn't get up. Lanky was kind of in and out. It was just so hard to see that they were dying. And the word came out. It was roughly 2004 that the team had slipped in the barn and broken her leg and she had to be put down. And I just couldn't go there anymore. I didn't see Peaches that way. And Lanky. And then word came out in, I think it was January 2005, that Peaches had died. And that was a killer. It was just a killer. So the push came out because of lots of people was to try to save Lanky and to get her to one of the sanctuaries, either down in Tennessee, but the best bet would have been out at Derby's place in California, just for the climate and because she had knowledge and had other Africans. And we knew it was going to happen. We predicted it was going to happen. But in the middle of the night, they snuck her out the back door. And on the way to her new place, pretty sure, positive, it was Utah or something like that, she died en route. And that let off a firestorm in the city of Chicago. And it got to a point where basically the zoo said that they would never, ever have elephants again. So that was the one plus that came out of all that. And it was right after that, there was 2 elephants at Brookfield Zoo. And 2 Africans, and one passed away. So they were looking to replace it. And by that time, there was enough people in the area that just weren't going to let it happen. So they had built, I think it was $10 million elephants, you know, brag and everything. Eventually, they just acquiesced and said, we'll get rid of our existing left one extinction. The one was there, went to Texas, not positive. And they said they'll never have elephants either. So they converted it to a rhino exhibit, African exhibit. So that was the only plus out of all of this journey and saga with the African elephants. It was, you know, you had to watch them all day. They're all dead now. They're all dead. The only one that's still alive that wasn't part of that initial herd was Dunda. And that was a huge elephant abuse case. Just as I was leaving the Zoological Society. And ironically, she was the one that was beaten the most, and she's still alive down in Texas, but all the rest of the girls that I work with are all dead. Every one of them. Either by grief or sadness. Definitely the case of the 3 that came to Lincoln Park, and Peaches and Mikey and the team. It was depression, and everyone could see it. And see it was coming. But the final twist to all of this was Larry Kilmer, who eventually became the director of the Zoological Society. Not director, but he was in charge of pretty much everything. He got terminated a few years ago for a lot of illegal animal dealings, which he had been doing for years anyhow. Maybe they just got fed up with it, or social media and the attention. And he wound up working as the director of collections at the Larley Zoo in Florida. How ironic, huh? Doing the same thing. Doing the same thing. And just roughly a couple years ago, ironically, Jeff Andrews, the big hero of the breeding group that was at the Wild Animal Park, who they did have babies, and they were breeding, and that was being split and shipped. At least one group went down to Scottsdale to a zoo there. That was another big uproar. That elephants were shipped back to the zoo, and he was running. He was an elephant runner, basically. And one day he just abruptly quit and walked out. So he got a better job offer and he left. And where is he now? 15 minutes away from the guy that hired him. He's working at Busch Gardens, which is roughly 15-20 minutes away from Lowry's. So they're all in the same boat still. They're all in the same group, still moving animals, still running elephants, still trying to run them around the country. The big push now is because you can't bring elephants in the country anymore, or at least not supposed to. They're breeding them. And there's a new group called the National Elephant Center in Florida, ironically, who is with the hope, which Jeff Andrews was at the Wild Animal Park, was to eventually stock zoos when they run out of elephants or elephants die for whatever reason. And so the goal in the future is to all the zoos in the country will probably have just African elephants if they get their wish and their way and what they're doing. So it's sad. It's very sad, the state of the Ellies right now and what's going on. The only benefit is there won't be any elephants in the Chicagoland area, hopefully in the future. Other zoos have stopped them. I know the Detroit Zoo has done it. A couple other zoos, when their elephants move on and pass on, will not replace them. I went to visit the park. This is how paranoid they are. I went to visit the park 3 years ago this July. And one of the keepers there, who had been there for years, who had known me, had just come out when I was leaving. And did something he shouldn't have done. Is he brought me, when the elephants were being shipped, they shift them into different yards to clean them because nobody touches elephants anymore. At least hands-on the way we do. It's protective care, basically, where it's best for everybody. And I think everybody misses out a little bit on it, but you don't work in with the elephants anymore. So when they shifted into one yard, he let me go into my old yard at the Wild Animal Park, the old African yard. And a week after I left, he was brought into the office and given a written reprimand and almost fired for that specific reason. And I had been in that yard since 1988, 87, something like that. It was 80. You know how many years had gone by to just 2 years ago. And that's how protective and scared they are. People are finally catching on to what's going on with the Ellies. But for me, it was a great experience. It was truly a wonderful experience to have worked with them and been around them and got to know them. But, you know, they're all gone. They didn't have to be all gone. They could all still be alive, but that's not what the business is about. It's about moving, trading, and exhibiting, not saving. That's a huge difference to be taught in how they're taken care of. Other nice thing is there's no more rides at the Wild Animal Park, no more shows. All of the Asians were shipped out to San Diego Zoo for their new exhibit. I think, not positive, a couple of them are still alive. Some have died. Most have died. But that's the nature of the business. But for me, it was great. It was great. You know, it would have been fun working with Kerulos and orangutans. That would have been nice and being really close to home. But it was great. A great experience. You know, when I was working, well, probably was one of the last groups that actually worked inside with a large group of elephants, not like one or two. And everything's moved with hydraulics now, and big gates and big doors, and there's such very little contact. But we used to have it all. It used to just be great to go out in the yard and just hang out and come up and rub into you. And You know, you could lay across them, you know, they'd play with you, they'd grab you with their trunks and pull you in. And it was an experience that will never happen again. I don't think with anybody. Because I know even at Pat's place, you know, before she passed away, she started using protective custody, protective handling, whatever. There's a bunch of different terms they use for it. So she was no longer going to live with the Ellis. So it was a blessing. It was great. You know, something I can always remember. With Gay's writing and her knowledge and her books, you know, it will stay in the forefront. It really will. It really will. It has to. Until there are no elephants in zoos anymore. And they are in sanctuaries. But the fight is big because of the breeding places and because of the power of money. And I can't tell you how much money was spent to bring those elephants over from Africa. And the payoff to the president of Swaziland to get them here. So it's all about money. Big money. And the fact that the people, the Clays, when I was there, even though they were terminated from what they were doing, they're still in the business. It's a very tight group of people running Ellis around the country. And circuses are another story. So that's another goal. And stuff I testified a few years ago in Chicago, try to get not bringing Ellis from the circuses coming into Chicago anymore. And the power of that lobby that people just don't know. The kids are the ones that will change it. You know, I gave a lecture one time at a high school, my daughter's high school, and the kids wrote letters. This was when the Ellies were dying in Lincoln Park. They wrote letters to the curator. And I think that has an impact, because that's their future. That's their future money. And if people demand no Ellies, there won't be Ellies in zoos. But it's still hard. It's still hard. And I'm very thankful for Gay writing what she writes. You know, about, it keeps it current. And, you know, the kids will listen.